Today, kind of wrapping up, hopefully tying a lot of things together. So how will beauty save humanity, right? Now, I'm a natural born cynic. So I'm born that way, that's me. Now, I'm not like an epistemological skepticist, right? I do believe in objective truth. And I'm not in some, constant state of malaise where I'm depressed all the time, although that happens sometimes, right? I believe that I'm a cynic in the true sense of the word, where I often read into things, and I always suspect that somebody's after their own self-interest. If you look it up, that's a definition for it, right? So when something good is going on, I immediately step back and wonder, like, okay, what's everybody's motives here? Now, maybe I go too far on that. My wife says sometimes I do, and she's usually correct. So back in the 80s, there was movements, if you want to call it that, because we didn't have the internet and we didn't have hashtags and everything else, so things had a different type of way of going through the culture. But there were these movements known as like Live Aid, Band Aid, USA, United Support of Artists for Africa, USA for Africa. Did you guys ever hear of any of those? All right. So, they were big. They had huge stars. I mean, I think Band Aid was over in England, so you had people like Elton John and mine just went blank, the guy from Wham, he passed away, not George Michael's. Sting, from the Police. I don't know if you guys know any of these groups. Sorry, but this is the age of the time. And then in the United States, you had other people. So anyway, you had anybody from McCartney. I mean, these were big names. And I think, like, before that, you even had, like, Michael Jackson, Lionel Richie, Quincy Jones, who was a huge producer, right? So what they were doing is they were all trying to raise money for starving children in Ethiopia, right? And I always have this, like, apprehensive approach to things like this. And it wasn't that I didn't think they were doing something good, but I am cynical. So I thought, is this a chance for them to show that they're people of goodwill? You see that a lot of times with, people that are in entertainment industries. It's their chance to show, the human side of them. And even if something good comes out of it. I also wondered, these people have so much money. I mean, whatever they're raising, I thought, isn't this pocket change, I mean, could they just give money they have? Do we have to have these big events? They raised a lot of money. But then I even wondered, like, where exactly does this money go? I mean, anybody who, I read this book once called Doing Good Better or something like that. Like how many people's efforts, to try to do good really don't hit the mark. Which is why you want to try to, it's fine if you want to help out neighbors or even homeless people, right? You can make a discernment there. But before we donate money, we want to make sure that this is going to, the bulk of it's going to go to what the cause we hope for. So Catholic Charities is a good thing. So is like Mennonite World Missions. I mean, you're talking like 90+ cents to every dollar goes to the actual event, as opposed to some other donations that you might give, which I won't name. It could be half of it goes. So I wondered, where's this money going? And then I also wondered, is money the problem? I mean, you can't always. I know it's a trite phrase. You can't always just throw money at a problem and fix it. And then I wondered too, like, well, what is the problem? I mean, if there's starving children in Ethiopia, what is the problem here? And how should we address that? Okay, so, that's my natural cynicism. Now, those of you that did any of the studies in feminist aesthetics that you touched on some of those, there was one or two chapters, I think, that talked about that. There's some stereotypes involved in that. Now, there's a lot of famine that goes in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. But it's also a stereotype, right? I mean, so we're so used to these images of starving children in Africa that we may be desensitized, and we also may, think that they all live like that. Especially like some of the photos that came out around these these Band-Aid movements. They'd have like happy, healthy white children sitting around a Christmas tree. And then they, contrast that with, a starving young black child from Ethiopia. Those pictures are really, not just contrasting, but they move you. But does that tell the whole story? So you guys that did some of those chapters in feminist aesthetics, you realize that's not the whole story, right? And by the way, the song, this is one of the songs that came out of this, maybe you hear it now. Do they know it's Christmas time at all? Feed the world. Okay, well, in Ethiopia, I didn't know it then, or I probably would have used it. I mean, you're talking over 60% Christian. They're Catholic and Orthodox. They probably know it's Christmas time. They probably are celebrating it in a deeper way than most of us here in this room, because they're not tied into the commercial aspects of it, right? So, we try to unravel some of this stuff. And there's famine down there also. And that famine, it's hard to get good figures on, like, what are we talking about when we say children are dying of hunger? Because, are they just dying because they are hungry? Maybe, but it's more likely that they are so malnutrition that, they catch other diseases and such. It doesn't make it any different, right? I'm not trying to say, well, that's different. But how's money going to fix, like, some of that? I don't know. And then, we also know that a lot of this famine and a lot of this poverty is caused by the despots that are down there, these people that are, taking over these countries. And even during, like, the 80s, there were international groups asking these people, don't send the money down there. There's no infrastructure. There's nowhere for us to get this out to the people that need it. And unfortunately, it may go to the villains. They may be the ones that get hold of this, and it'll just exacerbate the whole situation. So I don't know if I was right or wrong in any of that stuff, and I don't really know in the end how it all did. But here's the point. They did recognize that we are unified as a human species. I mean, you can't take that away from it, right? I mean, they thought we need to do something. We know that people are starving. We need to do something. So that's the kind of thing that I think, you could be cynical if you want. I can't seem to get over it. But we know that there's some drive there, right? And that's where we'll start out here. We have this desire for unity. We all do, right? Now, we didn't really start the course, but early on in this course, we talked about what it means to come into community and what are the advantages of belonging, right? So now we're just talking about the widest community possible as far as the human person is concerned. What does being a human person mean? And how do we come together and unify this group that we are? The article that you were to read by Krill talks about a few different ways, right? And these are common sense, but they're worth mentioning, right? So regardless of how things panned out, I'm going to say that, Michael Jackson and George Michael and those guys, they had good intentions, they had noble intentions, right? So, you could be trying to unify people for noble things. We recognize that they're a human and I'm a human, and something needs to be done. And that's good, right? It could also be somewhat benign, right? So they're almost neutral, where, we all are going to allow each other to exist in our own little groups. So you get your space and I get my space. This could be countries, this could be, smaller communities. We could even talk on the interpersonal level. So, sometimes it's almost like I'm just going to allow you over there, I'm going to be over here. We'll kind of have mutually support each other, but no direct thing. But the article also said that it could be very distorted, right? So sometimes, like, nations and empires and even smaller groups and communities will rise up hoping only to take advantage of those who are not as powerful as them. I mean, our world history is replete with this. You almost like you can't trust people with power because you don't know how they're going to use it. And almost always, people with power abuse it, which is one of the problems that went on in the Catholic Church. I mean, that's almost the basis of it. If you take away all the power and the money that comes from power, because money is just, a means to power, right? So, then what would they want? If there was nothing, like my phrase always is within the Catholic Church, I long for the day when the church has no money to lose and nobody to schmooze. There's nothing there. Just like the apostles. I mean, you can't steal stuff from poor people. And you can't, manipulate people if you have no power. To me, that's very Christ-like. Okay, that's aside. So, we have, all this that goes on. We're going to have to try to figure out from our point of view how this works for us and, exactly how we think it should work, right? Make sure I'm not missing anything here. Oh, I guess just to say, even like in movements, the hashtag movements that go on today, you see a mix of this stuff, right? I mean, you see people that come together for various causes, and it could be a mixed bag of people that are attracted to that, which is maybe why I always am a little leery too about getting involved in something, because I think there's people within these movements that I may not necessarily agree with. That's just my hang-up. That might be entirely wrong, but nonetheless, all right? Okay, so if we're going to say then that we desire for unity, we want to go the noble way, we want to make sure that we're all doing this because we recognize that we're one race, we're one people, you know, that seems pretty idealistic. I mean, like, come on, really? I mean, wake up. I mean, how are we going to do that? Well, the article talked that there are things that unify people that aren't always necessarily something that's simply noble, right? So we would all come together from an external threat, which is why, you know, you see after 9/11, you know, you saw the country just unite, because they recognize there's an external threat out there, and we have to guard ourselves against that. And two, I think this is a reason why even some of the movements you see, and I use like the pro-life movement, there's a lot of people within the movement that I don't have too much hope for, but yet they're going after the same cause, they are after the same, against the same external threat, so that aligns us. I mean, you've heard the phrase, you know, that common enemies unite groups, unite states, they unite communities, right? So that's what we have going on here. But the article points out this sad irony that, you know, if we're going to try to figure out what is the crisis, like, okay, if we're going to take this external threat, what is the external threat to the unity of the human race? I mean, who is that? There's not, like, you know, some monsters that exist on another planet that are invading us. So the sad irony is the crises that we are experiencing is that people are not caused externally. And that has to stop us in our tracks. You know, are we the cause of our own problems? You know, now, yes, I'm not talking about natural disasters and stuff, right? I mean, that stuff's aside. I'm talking about, because those things don't really threaten unity per se, right? They almost inevitably help us unify. But we're looking on the outside for a problem, and the problem's on the inside. Now, this has been like an underlying theme throughout this course that I've been trying to drive home, that we place way too much stock in social reforms and political activism, which are good, but they're not going to be the solution. You know, the revolutions we want usually are closer to home. In other words, maybe it's just simply a revolution of one. Just you do this, right? We might even look at that. That just came to me. Pope Francis talked about a revolution of one. Did you guys know he did a TED Talk? He didn't walk around and do the screen and everything. But he presented from his desk, and that was projected during a TED Talk. And he talked about that, you know. I mean, everybody wants to change everybody else because we don't have enough courage to change ourselves. And it is usually, sometimes for good reasons, we're worried about getting taken advantage of and such. But once we recognize that the crisis is not external, that it's internal, it's going to start to change the trajectory on exactly how we're going to look at this, right? So let's see. Oh, let me put it this way too. Okay, so I'm a spiritual person. I don't think it's unintellectual to talk about that I believe in objective good and evil. So I can talk about God and the devil without feeling like I'm some medieval knucklehead that has never been, you know, revealed anything scientific to the person. And I always, you know, did you ever watch like a magician or something? I mean, people with sleight of hand tricks, right? I mean, their whole goal is to distract you. That's the whole goal. The trick will not work. And they know it's an illusion. They don't have magic powers. They know that if they can distract you, so if they're using playing cards or something, there's always some element. They're going to have somebody walk behind them. They're going to do something with this hand while this hand's doing whatever. And that way you don't really see what's going on. Well, okay. From a Catholic ethos standpoint, we accept flat out that the devil's the father of lies, which means he's better at it than most. So I think this guy, you know, has, I hate to sound trite, tricks up his sleeve that we often just get distracted by. So we're always going to look around what's happening and see where am I being drawn in unbeknownst, right? So I think I shared with you once about this fourth century play called the Psychomachia by a guy named Prudentius, in the Latin play. Psychomachia means battle of the soul. So what they did was they personified all the virtues, so and the vices. So in the play, you have virtues and vices that are actually fighting out on the battlefield. And you know, these virtues are dying, these vices are dying. Well, at one point, a group of priests come out to nurture the dying virtues. And greed, in the form of avarice, this old haggard woman, you know, is there herself pulling all the spoils off of the dead bodies. Now, again, this is personified, right? And she tries to lure all the priests in with all this gold and stuff. But they see her for what she is, just simply avarice. So what she does is she transforms herself into a beautiful woman and transforms her name from greed to thrift. And they're attracted to that. And then she says, gotcha. Same thing. You guys ever watch The Devil's Advocate? And I don't want to give the whole thing away, but it starts out with a lawyer who's helping his client who was accused of raping and molesting this young girl with learning disabilities, and he got her off. And the devil used that ability as pride to get him and lure him into his particular law firm. There's a big story around it. Keanu Reeves, I can't ever say his name. He's the lawyer. And anyway, when he finally makes the fateful realization that he's being played, he gets transported back to that original moment. And now, when the reporter, the devil is both a lawyer and a journalist, you know, that scares a little bit. But anyway, so the journalist comes in and says, you know, again, tries to play him. And he sees it for what it is, because now he has the knowledge, and he says, no. And he says, come on, a lawyer with a conscience? This is wonderful. You know the story I can make with this? And the guy says, okay, call me on Monday. And as the reporter moves away, you've seen him turn into the devilish figure, and he says, pride, got him again. It's like there's always something around the side. So, I don't know, maybe my natural-born cynicism at least helps me in that way. But we have to start asking questions about how do we identify these crises within ourselves, right? Here's the reality, is that, you know, both evil and by this, we could talk about an ugliness, right, a lack of beauty, and any threat to unity is usually based on somebody who's working in a matter of strength and power. They either have it and don't want to give it up, or they don't have it and they want it. So, you know, that's the problem. So we spent a little bit of time here talking about how we come to objective truth, and is it possible to do that, right? So we talked about David Hume and how this is ought, right? Like, this is maybe not the best example, but it's a good physical example, and I might have mentioned it once. You know, so if we look at the design of something, like how a thing is, the reality, so we can look and say, well, you know, I have a torso, I have 2 legs, my knees bend, my ankles, I have foot and toes to actually help me with my balance. I'm bipedal. So the fact that my body's designed for that means that I can walk around quite easily. That's how my design is. So the is, how we find it, is the ought, how I ought to use it, right? Well, people would argue, but that doesn't mean you can't crawl around on all fours. That doesn't mean you can't, you know, do standing, you know, walking handstands or something. And so we make this case, just because we see how a thing is, doesn't mean how we ought. Now, the is the reality, and the ought is the moral element, right? But here's the question that you ask of something like that. Who determines then, if we don't have the is to choose it, like the reality that we see, the objective truth, then who determines how we ought to do it? I mean, let's not fool ourselves. It's going to be people who have strength and power. Dorothy Day even had a problem with using contraception to control populations in undeveloped countries. Regardless of how you would feel about any of that, she thought that's a form of genocide. That's one group saying you need to stop doing this. You know, so we have to ferret out these things. How is this working? And, you know, what are the ramifications of this? The intellect, using that to figure out morality is not going to be any really different, right? So we talk about Kantian rationalism or science and such. I mean, how do we do this? Like, do you guys know, like, there's parts of the world where they do female genital mutilation, right? It's part of, like, as the woman, they keep her libido repressed, right? They remove, you know, any aspect of the organ that might bring sensuality, right? So if we're, see, Hume was not a cultural relativist, nor a moral relativist. But once you take away, you know, the reality of the is, and then people still have to determine the ought, the morality of it, and we don't know where that comes from, it just, there's only one or two steps away from just saying, well, that's your truth and this is my truth. Because it tends to be sentiment, which is what he based it on. But how do we even do this with scientific rationalism? I mean, oftentimes scientific rationalism will do what it can, and then ask later, ought we do this? And we see this with, you know, what's going on now with gene editing, the CRISPR, and the technology and stuff. How do we use this, right? I mean, I just listened to a nice long podcast on that where, you know, if you have sickle cell anemia, perhaps you would like that typical gene to be edited so that it doesn't get passed on. But then what happens if you know, with a person with Down syndrome? Adults with Down syndrome are quite content who they are. They don't think they want to have their disease pathology. I mean, first of all, disease eradicated. I mean, so who's deciding this stuff? I mean, it's always going to be those with strength and power. So this, you know, so these things become an ugliness, and these things become some sort of what do you want to say? You know, resistance to our unity. And we may not, and they may be very difficult to ferret out, right? It's easy when somebody attacks us in a warlike, you know, stance like Pearl Harbor. We know that's our enemy. But this is a little bit more difficult, right? And it takes a little bit more discernment on our part, right? So we make, and as the article does, that good and evil are moral categories, right? And once you get into a moral category, they belong to the inner part of the human being. The inner part of the human being we are representing is the heart. This is our innermost being. So remember we said last class that this is where the battlefield is. It's in the human heart. I'm going to stick with that. Maybe it's not in the intellect, maybe it's not in the gut, maybe it is in the human heart. Which means we have an entirely different approach to how we're going to unify people. We can't just do it, you know, through scientific progress, although that's great. Technology is not going to solve all our issues. Because the reality is, once you take away the is and leave it at the ought, you're going to place emotion basically in the sphere of relative. There's a better way to say that. Let's put it this way. You're going to set it into the private sphere. So, you know, when we have lawyers, we have politicians, we hear this all the time, and so maybe sometimes you like it. I separate my personal beliefs from my public stances. Are you a schizophrenic? I mean, no, I'm not trying to make fun of anybody that has an issue, but seriously? So if this is stuff that resides in the inner being, are you telling me that your inner being has nothing to do with what you're going to do later? Now, you could say, these are my stances, and I represent a pluralistic society, and I will do my best. I accept that. But when somebody says, I refuse to have my private beliefs affect what I do when I'm elected, or when I'm a lawyer, or this or that, that troubles me. Because now I'm not quite sure, you know, is there more than one individual that I'm speaking with here? And how does one do that? But if you're going to relegate morality to the private sphere, that's the only alternative we have. Because how can I ever, my private sphere is different than your private sphere. It's totally subjective. And I can't impose my subjectivity on somebody else. And even if we try to do it, it's only going to be a matter of strength and power that's using that. I mean, this is kind of what's going on. You know, at least not just me, but a lot of us think. So we're going to say the destiny of mankind, then, is dependent on our spiritual state. Which means we've got to get our hearts in the right order. I don't know if when you read, it talked about the Dionysian principle, right? They described it as entropy. Well, this idea of Apollo and Dionysus, right? Dionysus is, you know, the emotive, the sensual aspects. You know, once we relegate that to a private affair, if you want to say it that way, it's just going to lead to disorder, which is what entropy is, right? And once it leads to disorder, we're outside of right order. We're outside of Tov, right? There's goodness and there's beauty. And how we started yesterday, or Monday's lecture with, it is not as it was meant to be. So the whole thing gets disordered. But the problem is, it looks right to us. It just seems like this is how things should work. And this goes back again to that line from the real Patch Adams. We need to be intentional persons. But this is not easy. And it often leaves us in doubt and uncertainty. I don't know what the next best thing is to do. You know, so if we spend as much time trying to form our hearts as we do even taking care of our bodies, or worrying about our future careers and such, if we even spent like, you know, just a percentage of it, what a different culture we would have. Because we would have transformed who we are. And to be honest, I think at the end of our lives, that's the only regret we're going to have. I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but I probably will be the only regret, you know, that I have, okay? So anyway, that decline to disorder. All right. Let's see if there's anything else here. Oh. I didn't have you read the last part of C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, but he goes on to talk about, once he gets past Men Without Chess, he talks about how, you know, once you see people rise with power and strength, you tend to have these groups that form, right? So the ones with power and strength, he calls them the conditioners. You know, the people that, you know, kind of like influence culture. Now, he didn't make this statement, but we could probably say this has to do with politicians. It has to do with entertainers and such, right? I mean, entertainers, they have a voice like we do. Unfortunately, you know, they have a voice that, you know, can spread across, you know, the entire United States, if not the world. So yeah, they may not always have the background to really, you know, formulate or articulate it right. But nonetheless, they become the conditioners, and all the other groups become the conditioned. And what happens then is anybody who has that sort of, you know, and it influences power. I mean, you know it. We love to be able to manipulate other people. Go back to high school, and all the little cliques that went on. We love to manipulate other people. So that doesn't go away, which is something that you always learn as you grow up. That all the crap that happened in high school, it just moves into like an office atmosphere. And it kind of happens in a more sophisticated, back behind the, you know, the door type of way. So there's always people that are trying to influence others and trying to find ways to get their foot in front of you. So in other words, nobody wants to give up this position of being a conditioner. We don't want to be the people who are being conditioned. He goes on to make a little bit more sense about that, but he says, what happens though is, he says they will use nature to do this. By nature, he means like the emotive and the desires. He says, but eventually those things overtake the individual. So even the person who is the one trying to do all the conditioning, they will eventually succumb to the very thing that they are using. And at that point, man will always use, and he says man will always use nature over other men. He means they will always use their own desires and their own wants over other men. But eventually, those own desires and wants consume them. Because then again, and I go back to thinking the trickiness of the father of all lies. It's the perfect way to sneak it in. If you read C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters, the one thing that the senior devil says to the younger devil, don't ever let them detect you. The minute that you get detected, they will figure you out and they will resist you. You have to let them think that they are just making these decisions on their own, and go even better and make them think that they're actually doing it for a good reason. He says, then you got them. And you can't do it with a full lie. It has to be a half-truth. There has to be something good in there. Because if you take away all the goodness, they'll recognize that too. So all of a sudden, we're back to this, how do we be intentional persons, right? He goes on to say in The Abolition of Man, and again, nature, about these emotions and desires, right? So if you're going to leave it there, once you've reduced one, he talks about the Tao. If you read The Abolition of Man, he'll start to say that there are these universal principles that we all accept. And the basic one is, you know, avoid evil and do good. He said you find, and he goes through and he lists all the different cultures where this shows up in. And he says it doesn't matter where you go in the world, it doesn't matter where you went in time, there were always groups of people that held on to these things. So if we're looking for what unifies the human person at the level of the heart, we need a principle. And he says, and that's one we could go on. So he says, for the sake of brevity, he goes, I'll just call it the Tao. And he says, we always know this. But he said, the minute that you don't think there's something objective or there's something that's universal, and everything simply is a matter of either your own particular perspective, it's only subjective, he says, then what happens? Then those subjective experiences are always going to be needed and cut into new shapes for the pleasures of whoever the conditioners are. Whoever has the power, whoever has the strength, will always be the ones that form those, right? And they have no motive but their own natural impulses. Which means, he goes, and at this point, man himself has been abolished. And we've done it to ourselves. Again, our threat is internal, right? Our crises are not external. This is all tying together. I mean, there's a lot of different things, you know, like, I didn't bring a lot of scripture in, but it won't be hard to do, okay? Now, the last, module was based on Beauty Will Save the World. So again, back to Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is now from another novel of his called The Idiot. And The Idiot talks about this, So you have an idiot who's also like a Christ-like figure, okay, which is interesting. And he says beauty will save the world. Now, we're going to have to understand beauty in the way that I explained it to you the other day, that beauty is connected to something objective, but it has a subjective element to it. But it is connected to goodness, right? So if we have the epistemological ladder, without beauty we'll never achieve the good. Well, we'll never get the truth. Without truth we'll never get to the good, all right? So Pope Francis came out with, a statement from a plenary assembly. And he says this, and it just fits right in. I mean, there's so many different elements from, literature and, church documents and just from philosophical aspects that tie all this together. So he says, beauty as much as truth and good, they lead us to God, the first truth. So there is something objective from a Christian standpoint, right? So he's the supreme good. In fact, God is beauty himself. I mean, we don't ever think about beauty being a person, but we should, right? Beauty means more than the truth or the good. To say something is beautiful is not only to recognize it intelligible and therefore lovable, which is something else. We love what we find beautiful. So we have to reorient what's been disordered and stop loving what's ugly. But that takes something that's objective to be able to understand it and make that statement, right? And also specifying our knowledge, it attracts us and it captures us with a ray capable of igniting marvel. So there you go back to Aristotle, like beauty is the splendor of truth. So when we're in front of something beautiful, whether it's a waterfall, right, that is sublime in itself, not just something that we project this sublimity onto it, it does stop us. And it might happen with you guys with, future spouse. It did me. I'm not an overly romantic person, and I knew from the minute I saw my wife I would marry her. I just knew it. And then I dogged her down for like 2.5 years and made it happen. But nonetheless, you can't explain those moments. Remember I was saying how they're like saturated elements? It's like the sponge can't hold it. And it's like you don't know what to do with these things. These are moments of truth. These are moments where you really can know something, probably knowing it better. In other words, the love that me and my wife might have, I might know better than certain empirical facts that I could show. And that may not be something I can explain to you, or if you had that experience that you can explain to me. It doesn't make it any less real. Right? It doesn't make me just some like hopeless romantic. This isn't about that. This is about if beauty is the bottom rung, then if we don't get that right, we're not going to get the truth. If we don't get the truth, we're not going to get to goodness. All right? Okay. I want some discussion on this, but let me end by doing this. Well, let me bring this up. Before I get there, Dante Alighieri. All right? So Dante, the way that his Divina Commedia goes is he starts out in the mid part of his life. Okay, so he's in his 40s, and he's confronted with dark woods. Now, there's animals and such that represent different things, and I'm not going to give you the story. So he's not finding himself in a good place in life. So this is you. There was a guy that wrote a book, Rod Dreher, says, how Dante saved my life. It's okay. He gets a little whiny in it, talking about his own personal issues, but nonetheless, it's a pretty good book. Again, I think I'm a little prejudiced, but I think it's one of the greatest poems ever written. So as Dante then gets into Inferno, hell, right, he meets Virgil, Virgil the poet. Virgil represents reason. Now, we're tying all this together, right? So this is rationality. And reason, as Virgil, is his God. So reason takes him through Inferno, and reason takes him through Purgatorio. But at that point, reason stops. Reason cannot take him to paradisio, right? We're now in the element of theology and divine revelation. And divine revelation may not sit well with some people because you can't empirically prove it, right? But from a Catholic ethos standpoint, at some point reason fails. Now, I think we accept this. If you fall deeply in love with somebody, it doesn't have to be romantic. At some point, reason doesn't, I mean, you're beyond an argument stage. You can't make the argument for why this person should be with you. I mean, there's something else that's happening, and you might not be able to put your finger on it. It might be a little more sublime, and it certainly might feel mysterious, but nonetheless, it's very real. And you sense that, right? So at some point now, his love of his life, Beatrice, it looks like, she shows up. Now, he loved this woman. In fact, in Vita Nova, he wrote the book about her. This was the love of his life. He's only ever seen her twice in his life. I think one at like, I don't know, 9 or 10, another time at like 17. Never was romantically involved with her at all. They both married different people. She died young in her 20s. But his entire life, this was the woman he loved. And he wrote all of this, all his writings, to her. So who shows up in heaven to now be his guide? Beatrice, right? She then represents divine revelation. And she will take him through the various cantos and spheres of heaven. But even divine revelation has its limits. So when he gets to like the final spheres, right, if you want to call it that, she has to step back. Because at some point, even divine revelation is no good. He's getting close to actually what we call the beatific vision of love, where he will see God as he is. So St. Bernard of Clairvaux shows up. He's a mystic, which is interesting, right? So now it gives you an idea on what a Catholic ethos would tell you, what is some of the highest forms of knowing, those people that are mystics. They're having experiences that we cannot empirically show, yet they're that important. But before he goes to see God, he has to be prepared. So who shows up? The Madonna. Remember we talked the other day about the two? The Madonna is the pure this beauty and Sodom the other. The Madonna shows up. She almost has to get him ready for the experience that his human form will not be able to take. She can't even smile at him. If she were to even smile, it would be overwhelming for him, right? So she prepares him for this last encounter. And then at this point, though, all he has left is his will. That's it. It's all about his will and love at this point. There's nothing else. Revelation's gone. All his intellect's gone. He's almost at this point now uniting exactly how he feels with the Trinity. So how it goes, and this is, Gustave Dore's famous illustrations. This is the beatific vision. So this is the last lines of the Divine Commedia. Here my power rests from their highest fantasy. In other words, there's no more use of my mind here, right? I'm resting from all of that. Already I can feel my being turned. There's different translations. I think I have 7 different translations in a couple languages. In some translations, because some are capture the poeticness of it, like Longfellow. This is from Chiardi. They'll capture more of the literal aspects of it. But this is innermost being. So his will, some of them say his will and his desires are now turned. In other words, his will and his desires are now being unified. There's no more of this struggle between, in the beginning, tov, good, beautiful, it's meant as it is as it's meant to be, and now we're back here again. All right? So at this point, he says, my instinct and my intellect are absolutely balanced. So there's no more conflicts. He doesn't have to struggle with this, right? And then he sees as a wheel. What he sees is he sees 3 concentric circles, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and he can't figure out how they are working and how they're not moving. But yet they are moving. This is all like just mysterious to him, right? I mean, this is a mystical experience. And he says, by the love, he's talking about, this is the only name God can have at this point, right? That moves the sun and the other stars. And that ends the poem. What it means is, what moves the human heart is God's love. So if we always wonder how, from a Catholic ethos standpoint, and this isn't just Catholic, how is God connected to each of us? It's like if he were to withdraw his love, we would just disappear, right? So he sustains us by that. This gives a different understanding. So if we're going to talk, let's just wrap it up, if we're going to talk about how we are unified in some way that maybe not idealistic, it's going to have to be at the level of the human heart, which means that we're not going to be looking for these external causes. I mean, we may come together against an external threat, but once we realize the threat and the crises are internal, then the only thing we have to do is to turn our own hearts. And that's not going to be easy. But that's the only way out of this, per se. All right? Anyway, what do you think? Questions?